Oh, sorry.
Well, thank you for joining. As you probably know, this is the first of 4 events in our Rupture series. So the series title is Rupture, the US and the Fate of World Order. So lofty topic to be talking about. And so this is the first session. We're going to talk about democracy and human rights today, and what's happening in the current moment in that realm. And then we have upcoming events on security, trade and global economy, and then multilateralism as whole. So we hope you'll join us for all of those. My name is Jessica Olney, and I recently joined IIS as executive director. And I will just take a moment to introduce everyone here today. So this is our panel. Some of you may have attended talks with some of these folks in the past. This is Bennett Freeman, who is our incredible senior fellow at IIS, and he's had more than a 4-decade career working in business, government, and human rights at that intersection. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary for DRL, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the US State Department in the 90s under Clinton, so has a very insider perspective on these issues. And he's been a senior ESG leader and advisor for years, and advises companies, investors, and NGOs on responsible business strategy, and is also a proud Cal alumnus. And then Susan Hyde is one of our faculty co-directors, and she's a political scientist, a professor here, and studies election observation, election fraud, democracy promotion, authoritarianism, and has served as an international election observer in many countries. And she is known for her rigorous research with real-world democracy policy questions, such as those we will discuss today. And then finally, Brad Adams is the founder and executive director of Climate Rights International, and previously led Human Rights Watch's Asia division for 20 years. Spent many years living in Cambodia, but also is an alum of Cal, studied at Berkeley Law, and founded the Berkeley Community Law Center. And so continues grassroots legal work, and is still involved with global human rights advocacy all over the place, and lives in Berkeley. Berkeley. Out. So, and then Daniel Sargent, sure many of you know, who's along with Susan, the IIS faculty co-director, historian, focuses on US foreign policy and the international order, and is writing a book on history of US-led world order that is summary at the moment, so stay tuned for that, and known for historical perspectives on diplomacy and foreign affairs. And so Daniel will be our interlocutor for the conversational format with the panelists, and we'll have a bit of back and forth with some questions, and then we'll open it up to audience questions.
So over to me. Okay, I'm going to start this off just with a quick note of apology, preemptive apology. I got to leave at 1:30 for childcare responsibilities, so I'm only going to be able to manage the first part of the conversation, and then I'm going to turn things over to Jess to mediate a conversation between all of you and the panelists. I'm very sorry not to be here for the entirety, but it's my privilege to be able to talk with these 3 wonderful interlocutors for an hour. So I thought that we would start out with some kind of basic definitional questions. We're here today to talk about democracy and human rights in relation to the crisis of world order through which we may presently be passing. The 3 of you bring a great deal of experience across a variety of different domains, thinking about human rights and democracy. But I wanted at the beginning to disentangle these 2 concepts. Human rights and democracy, I think we can all agree, are goods, positive values that our politics at the national and international scales strive to uphold and affirm. But what is the substantive content of these 2 terms, democracy and human rights, for each of you? How do you see them? How have your perspectives as practitioners and as academics sort of shaped your orientations towards the conceptual categories at hand? Maybe we could start this off with Brad, because you're seated closest to me.
Thank you very much. So democracy and human rights are codependents, and It is not the same legal framework. It is not necessarily the same conceptual framework. But in my experience, not just in principle, you can't really have one without the other. And I think there's been a lot of, I'm not trying not to talk too much because I want to, I don't want to create a whole discussion, but there's a lot of glib discussions of democracy that aren't really democracy. In the American conception, they really are about there's an election, the winner peacefully takes power, and therefore we call them democracy. And in reality, in many countries, you have that without even close to democracy. So what's a democracy? Genuine and periodic elections, of course, that's a real obvious part. That's the part that Americans tend to identify with democracy. But you have to have a free press. You have to have an independent judiciary. You have to have an independent police force, independent prosecutorial service. You have to have the ability of people to the rights to freedom of assembly, association, and expression. Yeah, the corollary to that obviously is a free press, a free media. And election time, you have to have equal and fair access to media. Those are all basic staples of democracy, but they're also individually separate forms of human rights. When you start doing election observation, this is what I'll pass to you, because you have to get really granular with all that. I'll just give you one example. I lived through Cambodia in 1993. The UN had the world's largest peacekeeping mission as part of the to allow Cambodia to emerge finally from the Khmer Rouge period and the post-Khmer Rouge dictatorship to have an election. That election was extraordinarily bloody. The opposition had almost no access to state media. There was very little freedom of expression, very little ability for parties to campaign. The opposition won in spite of all that. And the United States government and many other governments declared that Cambodia was a democracy. It was anything but it was a small miracle the opposition wanted, just reflecting the fact that people were fed up with the government in place. And so it is really important that we drill down on this and understand what the difference is between a democratic state and a state that just had election.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. I have a lot of things that I can say about this topic, but generally I agree with everything that Brad just said. One of the things that I think is an important distinction to make, though, is that human rights can be violated at the level of the individual. When rights of individuals are violated in connection to their participation in a democracy, those are still called violations of human rights. And we don't get threats to democracy unless things are added up at some scale, often to the national or at least regional level, in terms of violations of what we would call common democratic practice. Another thing to just note in relation to sort of reacting to some of the comments that preceded me, are that when governments are declaring whether or not a country is democratic or not, they often have other motivations underlying that declaration. And the diplomatic motivations are often, as we were discussing before the panel, to move on, get out, and have plausible deniability if they did something that they were supposed to do within the country. And so most people on the ground are fully aware, like I think in this case, that Cambodia wasn't a fully functioning democracy. A lot of other countries that we treat as democracies globally are not really fully functioning democracies. And part of that is, I think, related to plausible deniability about some of the other actions that a diplomatic actor might be taking. But overall, I agree completely that these are things that it's really hard to have democracy without human rights. It's really hard to have respect for human rights without democracy. And so in that sense, they're conceptually distinct, they go hand in hand. And the crisis that we're currently living through, the rupture that we're living through, similarly afflicts them both together.
Maybe not surprisingly, but not very ultimately, I'm in emphatic agreement with both Susan and Brad. It really is, in my view, no democracy without human rights, no human rights without democracy. I unexpectedly got into this fight, and it was a fight at the time. Long ago, in June of 1993, 6 months into the first Clinton administration, which I served initially then as Chief Speechwriter for Secretary of State Christopher. And I was in charge of this speech at the Vienna Human Rights Conference in June that year, June 1993. And to my shock, I got in a real argument, fight with the people at the National Security Council of the White House as to whether this was a democracy or human rights speech. It was the Vienna Human Rights Conference. And I was reminded that Clinton cared deeply about democracy, given a speech in Milwaukee when he was running for president. Democracy is the new post-Cold War world priority, and that he didn't apparently get the memo despite having been in Iraq and in the war room. This has to be a democracy speech, and I pushed back hard. And ultimately, Secretary of State Christopher came down on the side that this is, as I recommended, primarily a human rights speech, but secondarily a democracy speech, and pointing out the exact mutuality between the two. But there has been tension between the two in U.S. foreign policy and diplomacy, and we can get to that later. And I worry a lot now that as our own democracy is being shaped, in my view, of what it's worth to its foundations, and as human rights, as we can discuss later, have been more or less abandoned in U.S. foreign policy, that we have a disjunction too, with really very worrying implications. I'll just add one other super quick point, which is, yes, democracy and human rights, but I think we've learned the last 3 decades since the end of the Cold War and the emergence of a more globally interconnected world, the absolute critical role of civil society. It's really only emerged in a lot of countries beginning in the 1990s. And just as there could be no democracy without human rights, or human rights without democracy, there can be no democracy or human rights without vibrant civil society. Brad alluded to that already. But rule of law, basic civic freedoms, and the ability of people to organize, whether trade unions, NGOs, or otherwise, absolutely critical and under severe pressure all around the world now.
So we're all in agreement with what we might call the Frank Sinatra theory. You can't have one without the other. That's love and marriage. Let me, push a little bit harder, because I can tell it's going to be difficult to elicit disagreement from this panel. So I really have my task cut out for me as a interlocutor today. We've talked about definitions. Let's pause and do a very quick diagnostic. Where are we today in our global situation? Are we passing through a democratic recession, a democratic crisis? I would like to get a really quick, almost a yes/no response from each of you. Are we in a crisis? And if so, how many alarm bells are ringing?
Yes, all of them.
All of them. So 5-alarm fire, big city fire.
Yes, with qualifications.
So you're less pessimistic perhaps than Susan. Good.
Yes, a 10-alarm fire, not that the US is the only country in the world, but when our democracy is in crisis, the repercussions from the whole world. India matters, Hungary matters, other countries matter that have had democratic challenges, Brazil a few years ago, but when the American democracy is shaken to its core, as I at least believe it is now, that has profound global implications.
This is great. So we have our panelists lined up from least pessimistic to most pessimistic, which was wholly unintended. It gives me material to work with, which is very good. So we've done definitions, we've done diagnosis. Let's turn now to causation. I want to come back, Brad, to push a little bit harder at the reasons for your somewhat more optimistic characterization of the situation. So we'll return to that. But I want to ponder the question, how did we get where we are today? What are the causal drivers of the democratic crisis, the democratic recession that each of you recognizes? And this is, for me, a perplexing problem, because democracy may not be entirely innocent among the causes of the democratic crisis through which we are plausibly today passing. Let me give you a couple of illustrations at that point. Number one, In the United States, the democratization of the procedure whereby our two major political parties select their presidential candidates has been a plausible driver of destabilization in the United States. It used to be the case that political elites got together in dark, smoky rooms and gave us presidential candidates. They gave us such stalwart presidential candidates as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Dwight David Eisenhower. Today, we let the voters decide in primary elections. And look where that's gotten us. Second, it's true. Second example of how democracy can lead democracy astray, Viktor Orban. Might democracy, to push a little bit harder at my opening question, be part of the explanatory framework if we are to understand the contemporary crisis of democracy? I don't know where to begin.
Well, since I've mischaracterized myself as maybe even a slight optimist about our situation, if the question before is about the United States, then I'm fine.
Yeah.
Globally, I think there's a little more space. But to your point, I don't think that you can blame a system that intends, and we're talking about democracy as we understand it, intends to reflect the will of the people for the problems that we're facing. The causal problem we're facing now in this country, I think in India, clearly part of the problem. A lot of places, keyboard armies, is that we live in this fire of disinformation. We don't have a national political culture, a national political conversation, and that can be said in many places. India is a perfect example. In around 2006, Human Rights Watch released a report on Kashmir. We trashed the army from human rights violations. I went to Kashmir, I met the head of the army over there. I came back to Delhi and I was on an hour-long TV program on the CNN of India, where I debated the head of the army, the recently retired head of the army. It is inconceivable that I'd be allowed to go to India to Kashmir now. It's inconceivable that I can get on TV more than one, because it is now corporate control, political party control, and the public wouldn't tolerate it because they're living in a different platform. And then the other just very brief point is the corporatization of politics, which is not just the US phenomenon. Corporate interests, and now we see it largely in its greatest expression with big tech, are basically owning the space and driving the conversations. And so those are all major pathologies that create the tunnel on fire that we're talking about. But I think there are places where they're shoots and daylight. That's why we do fire cloud uses.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of global trends that we can talk about as causal. One is definitely related to the media environment and how that's shifted. If you go back to like Joseph Schumpeter or something like that, the spread of mass media was really critical in the spread of democracy. There's other people you can bring into this conversation, but just very briefly, the degree to which politicians around the world can lie directly to their supporters using fairly targeted propaganda. And it is a system that's reinforced by the way that people are now consuming their news media is part of the problem. Another part of the problem that has to be brought up is rising income inequality within many countries in the world. That is, as Adam Dworsky has said, is historically unprecedented in many countries in the world. The degree to which income inequality has stretched, it's just grown further and further apart since at least the 1970s, and that has to have something to do with the threats to democracy that we're seeing. What we've seen in the last year, though, is the U.S.'s challenges with democracy and the changes in U.S. foreign aid acting as, I think, an accelerant to trends that were already ongoing, trends away from democracy and trends away from human rights. And this is something I've written a little bit about, but I have to say with two of my students, Jenny Parker. But it's a real challenge. The point you made, Daniel, about the problems with primaries. I just brought this up on Saturday to a different speaking engagement. Robert Dahl was on top of it. After the revolution, he wrote exactly about this, that a democracy should not have democratic subcomponents. Why? because it challenges expertise, and expertise is often valuable. In his analogy, you don't want to have a surgeon being told where to cut next by the operating gallery, the viewing gallery in the operating room. You want the surgeon to be able to apply their expertise about where to cut. The same is true, according to Robert Gall, in democracy subunit. So I just want to say that the reason why we like democracy is not that it never selects bad leaders. It's that it has a system for getting rid of them, that it can be peaceful, right? It has the ability to correct. So there's nothing about democracy that prevents the election of leaders that ultimately become very unpopular. But where authoritarian regimes are brittle when they have a bad leader, they tend to have to experience violence or increased violence in order to have some replacement of that bad leader, unless they're like a really well-functioning single party system or something like that. I have lots more to go, but Brendan, go ahead.
You're the real scholar with this, Susan, and I'm struggling to disagree at all with what Susan and Brad are saying. I would put a maybe even sharper point on democracy, and I say this is both the big D and small d Democrat, that I worry about unconstrained democracy, and I think democracy on its own, without that grounding, both rule of law, human rights, and civil society, can be dangerous. We've seen that in India. We've seen Modi trying to exclude, discriminate against hundreds of Muslim Indians. It's the most populous Muslim country in the world, and yet you have an effort here to impose Hindu hegemony in what was a marvelously diverse pluralistic society and polity. We saw Bolsonaro try to subvert Brazilian democracy. Unfortunately, that didn't work out, either at the ballot box or the courts. But democracy, we have to be very careful. And, to invoke, I'm sorry to have to invoke, but it's been on my mind and many other people's minds a lot recently. Hitler was democratically elected. Now, he subverted democratic processes in 1932 and 1933. And there was a weak democratic Weimar Republic. There were overly powerful military and aristocratic and business elites there that helped enable his rise to power, but he manipulated democratic process. So democracy on its own doesn't work without that grounding in the triad or tripod of rule of law, human rights, and civic freedom, civil society, in my view. We can all come back more at the tech piece, which is hugely.
Yeah, absolutely, please.
Just really quickly, I forgot to mention, which is also the post 9/11 world and the war on terror.
Yeah.
Had huge global implications for both human rights and democracy and U.S. foreign. I think that's the beginning of this tide of U.S. support for democracy globally and many other.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely, please.
on your point about democracy, I think one interesting subcomponent of that is how democracy is organized. So, for example, Hitler was not democratic. His government wasn't put in power with democratic exercise. He represented a minority party.
Yeah.
And we all know that I think most of us probably know this story. Modi has never hit over 40%. And Territory in the Philippines never got 40%. Keir Starmer, 34% less. And he has this massive majority. So sometimes
Noriega, who changed the electoral system such that he get elected with 37% of the vote, or whatever he got the previous 5 times.
And Trump in 2016.
and so sometimes if the structure isn't keeping up with the risks, and so is that a flaw in democracy, just a flaw in structure? I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's a really powerful point, and it's a reminder that in order to understand the crisis of democracy, we have to understand the institutional structures that make democracies work. It may also be a reminder of the need to differentiate between modern democracy, and I think this is a point that Susan made implicit in her last response, and the classical archetype of democracy, the Athenian variety of democracy, which was different in fundamental respects, because Athenian society was fundamentally different from modern society in very basic ways. Athens at its apex in population about the size of the city of Berkeley's population today. It was a polity in which direct participation was possible.
Yeah.
And that, leads me to question, which is, you have all mentioned in different ways the propensity of novel information technologies to empower forms of political participation that can produce populist or majoritarian political outcomes. Might we think about this propensity of new information technology to empower populism as, in some ironic sense, producing a return of dynamics more characteristic of Greek democracy within the institutional framework of modern representative democracy? I'm sorry about such a historian's voice. You can forget the Greek analogy and just focus on the majoritarian and populist elements of our present crisis.
Just knit together, all right, this is what we've gotten so far in the conversation. In the last 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, I'm sorry to say, but I think it's true that liberal democracy around the world, in various countries, including the US, has failed to tackle some of the biggest challenges, the inequities of globalization, the unconstrained, that exacerbated existing income inequities within and among countries, despite reductions of poverty in some countries at an absolute level. That plus economic insecurity and the perceptions, right or wrong, fair or unfair, of trade agreements. The inability, this is touching a potential third rail, but the inability of global democracies to balance diversity and pluralism with protection of borders. And if there's anything that has led to populist nationalism in Europe and the UK with Brexit and Trump's election in 2016 and then in 2024, it's been that issue. And then on top of that, this information deluge that is unconstrained. I'll just say one thing about that and then turn to the others. And this is the most fundamental point of all, and it's the one that is like where I fear that the genie is out of the bottle, foreseeable future, but we have lost the most fundamental bedrock of all, whether it's democracy or human rights or society, which is agreement on fact and truth. And the late great senator, who I certainly can always agree with, David Patrick Moynihan, famously said in the 1980s, I think you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. That axiom has been blown up, and I don't know how it's reconstructed, at least across the board in the US, the rest of my lifetime. But, and we know many of the drivers, others can discuss them, I could get more into it, but we have let technology become unconstrained, become a long way from where we were a dozen or 15 years ago, where there was an overall view that the rise of the internet was going to be a net plus for democracy and human rights. And one of our audience members, whom I know well, Rebecca McKinnon, published a book a dozen years ago in the morning. That probably wasn't the case, but we could get more into that.
They're married for their point.
No, I honestly don't have much to add. I would just say that, in Athens, there wasn't crowdsourcing of leadership and that's what I thought, right? So you would have had the opportunity here in the proceedings. Right now, a lot of people are just being fed one line, but our line, our views probably look very similar. And we thought those views are very different.
Brad, can I put a direct question to Brad? Because I was really struck during Bennett's last remarks by the potential downstream implications of disinformation for the work of human rights activism. Insofar as information has really been the lifeblood of human rights activism, how has the flood of disinformation affected the work of human rights in which you've been so intimately involved for so long?
Well, I'll give you 3 examples. I know run Climate Rights International, and the amount of climate disinformation out there that we received by people in many countries is just off the charts. So we have a climate emergency. We are facing an existential crisis. If you care about your children and grandkids, it would be a top issue for you. And in many parts of the world, you're being told that this is a hoax, not this one. Big oil doing this, many other actors are. And you would think that, there's even a possibility of going through a period of global cooling, because that's right. In India, the information fire hose would mean that disinformation fire hose would mean that most people wouldn't know what Beckett's talking about. If you are at all a supporter of Modi and his media, you will have no real idea of the risks and suffering that the woman is facing. And I was going to also just mention the Philippines, where the successive governments have been elected on disinformation. People think that the Philippines is a democracy. It's a democracy. But not based on meaningful information, basic knowledge and equals and uses.
Can I bring up two separate trends that are kind of related, but I'm gonna put them in two separate buckets. One is related to how technology has influenced the threats that we're experiencing to democracy and human rights, and that is the degree to which the surveillance state has become an export commodity. And states are actually learning from each other about how to surveil their own citizens. It's very hard for opposition and human rights activists to operate the same way that they used to, from my understanding, but I'll hopefully say more about that. But the surveillance that they're under and the inability thus far for them to have the tools that they need to counter that have been, at least by the messages that I've been getting from folks around the world, a major change in the last 15 to 20 years. The other thing that I've heard about, I had the chance to attend a meeting of democracy activists from authoritarian states that was kind of like chatting about the rules and stuff, but I can talk about some of the stuff that came up in it. One of the trends that I didn't know, which is the newly elected opposition politicians in more authoritarian contexts and democracy activists in more authoritarian contexts are all under just an extraordinary amount of regime complicit internet harassment, including up to and including death threats that are credible, that they are absolutely powerless to do anything about, because the local police might be complicit. Many of these threats are coming through Facebook or other social media, and the Facebook office that many of these things get routed through is in Russia, and they do not trust what is required by Facebook to do anything about this, right? To reduce the harassment they're experiencing is a police report from their local government. It doesn't have to be a genius to come up with why it's hard for some of those governments to get, or some of those individuals who are being threatened to get a police report from their local government. Why? Because the local government is part of who is harassing them, of their opposition leaders and opposition politicians. So they literally can't combat this in a similar way. So I think that's sort of another problem, that are these like multinational media conglomerates that are doing nothing to help the cause, that they prevent this type of online harassment of politicians, and newly elected governments are often facing just a huge amount of challenge of disinformation that impedes their efforts to govern.
All right, let's do another lightning round before we take on another media question. We're all old enough, I think, to remember the halcyon 1990s and the optimism that attended the rise of the internet. Could each of you identify the point at which the scales fell from your eyes and you first began to comprehend just how disruptive information technology could be for democracy and human rights?
Oh, information technology.
Yeah. Well, the internet, the whole complex of technologically empowered information conveyance.
Well, I'm going to give a shout out to Rebecca, because when I was Human Rights Watch, she wrote a report with us on the Great Firewall. And that was a sign of things that could come. It's a little bit different. That was about denying people access to information. But also, the Chinese state is really good at feeding people what they want them to hear. The best. There's that every element of the best. And so one of the reasons we took that up was not just because of the concerns about access to information for people in China, but it was a model when you talk about it. And we did a lot of work since then. For my work in what we would call democratic societies, I think the Philippines one, when Duterte got elected, it was clearly based on this massive disinformation virus. And it was something that I hadn't seen, it was my local folks in Asia. I hadn't seen carried out such a degree of precision and multiple effects. Be very good at it.
Yeah, I mean, there was a few, I mean, Brad just mentioned the report that he worked on with Rebecca for Human Rights Watch. So China had this great firewall. China pretty well established by 2004, 2005. The whole extent of surveillance that was not created, but vastly extended immediately after 9/11 in Bush too, and perpetuated for the most part during not only Obama, let alone Trump, but then from Biden to this day, is the second piece. And the third piece has been the spread of internet shutdowns of countries all around the world that have crippling effects, not only on civil society, but on basic commerce and the ability of people just to conduct their daily lives. And then, of course, Susan already referred to it, but you know, the famous phrase now, surveillance capitalism, and the degree to which the internet companies, mostly those based in Silicon Valley, you know, just were untrammeled in the last decade in collecting data and using multiplying advertising and really largely unconstrained. And then, you know, all this continues even more exponentially with the advent of AI and the failure thus far in efforts to at least pose some kind of guardrails, let alone governance. The Trump administration's demolition of efforts to do so in the US, not only at the federal but state level, threats against the EU and the UK, if they make their own rules. So here we are. We're in a very dark place now. Again, sorry not to, you know, I'm optimist by nature, but it's hard to do anything but very pessimistic about these converging trends on tech and democracy.
Susan, what did you have?
I think my like true falling through was probably in the late 2000s when there was this movement to crowdsource everything associated with human rights and election observation, and that you could rely on people like individuals tweeting all of the problems, and that was going to be replace the human rights watch type industry. And I can't remember the exact year of it. It was somewhere in the late 2000, early 2010. And it just struck me as a terrible idea, but also kind of the moment at which people seem to be believing too much in what Stanford had a lab. I think maybe it's still be called Rev. It was based on Revolution Technology was their initial lab, and it was so positive initially. It always sounded a little bit like it was they're gonna have to rename it.
The three of you were all more cosmopolitan and more astute than I was, because it really wasn't until November 2016 that the scales fell from my eyes on this particular question. But let's pivot to talk about a really hard question, which is the constitution of international order in relation to the values, democracy, and human rights that we have been discussing today. I think it would be fair to say that human rights and democracy, but perhaps especially human rights, have existed in fraught relationship to the post-war international order, really since the inception. The Charter of the United Nations makes explicit reference to the realization, to the advancement of human rights as a guiding purpose for the UN. At the same time, the UN was constituted politically and legally as an organization of sovereign states, each of which remained sovereign with regard to their domestic affairs. To espouse the causes of human rights and democratization as global causes is at some level almost inevitably to challenge the premise that nation states, or at least the sovereign leaders of sovereign nation states, must be wholly free and sovereign to adjudicate their own internal business. We exist, of course, in a moment of complex crisis in which the proximate political pressures bearing down upon democracy and human rights are really immense for all of the reasons that our panel has discussed. But when it comes to the basic architecture of international order, do you see any basis for optimism as to our capacity, perhaps not in our lifetimes, but in the lifetimes of our youngest students, to reformulate, reform international order so as to make it more conducive to the ongoing realization of democracy and human rights objectives?
I'm optimistic that, Berkeley students, and students and young people everywhere can, carry a torch, not for the old order as it was constituted with the contradictions that you rightly identified, Daniel, but on a normative basis that has fundamental rules, multilateral institutions, mechanisms, and respect for human rights. I think it's premature to write off the UN, let alone to embrace so-called board of peace that's now talking about stable coins to fund construction for the Mediterranean for the era of the future in Gaza. It's disgraceful. But look, there's been a lot of debate here in recent months and weeks, particularly following Canadian Prime Minister Carney's quote unquote rupture speech that gave us the title of this series, where he basically declared the post-war international rules-based order to be dead. I believe it's gravely damaged, but not dead. It needs to not be, cannot be reconstituted as it was, but it needs to be revived, at least around basic rules in the international community, basic multilateral institutions that work side by side with national sovereign national governments. But it has to be reformed. It is an absurd, offensive anachronism in the third decade of the 21st century to have a permanent five just in the United States, China, Russia, and for God's sake, Britain and France. And I say this in deference to Daniel, having been born in Britain, raised in Britain, and I spent much of my time there. These are great places, but to not have India, Brazil, Nigeria, this is just, it doesn't pass a laugh test for 10 seconds. So I think that there is work to be done by all of you in your lifetimes and your careers to help not only revive, safeguard democracy in the United States, to help reform the international community in ways that are more equitable and sustainable and frankly legitimate. And our work is cut out for us, but God help us if we give up on a rules-based order, even though it must be.
I just give you an example of a pet peeve of mine. I've been working human rights for a long time. Starting war is the biggest cause of human rights abuses by a factor of and yet until recently there was no real consequence for starting a war. So it violated the UN Charter, and then so what? Particularly with the problem with Security Council that Bennett just mentioned, very hard to get agreement unless it's a small country. So parenthetically, to your point about the architecture, one of the problems with human rights architecture at the beginning is victor's justice, great power justice, great powers of rights, small countries don't. But when it comes to armed conflict, there was nothing to do except the methodology that a lot of human rights organizations have adopted, which is to monitor the human rights abuses during them. So there wasn't anything that said that there would be consequences for starting war. And recently, there has been an amendment to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court that created a crime of aggression. So you can imagine how will that be prosecuted, how you get custody over someone who violates that statute. Those are all very important, complicated questions. But you can imagine that there are ways to reimagine things. With the Security Council, for example, it will do no good to anybody to just expand it without reforming it. How do you reform it? Well, for a long time, the European Union has operated on the basis of unanimity. They call it consensus, but basically unanimity. They've created carve-outs. The Security Council will have to, we get these big powers that have competing interests, they'll have to have a different way of making decisions. So you can imagine that we can make progress architecturally international law with human rights. I think it's much more difficult to imagine that we're going to make big promise bringing democratic norms into domestic jurisdictions of a lot of states that are just going to be resistant to them. That's a much bigger ask, and that's where there's a real difference between democracy and movements.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that like some of where we're at in terms of the international order swing is between a moment in which we had a growing emphasis on what I'm going to call popular sovereignty and human security. And then I do think it started with a little bit the war on terror and maybe the Iraq war shifted that back towards a focus on state sovereignty and national security. And the thing that I'm optimistic about is that I think generally speaking, people who have had an opportunity to live with human security, live in an environment where they've experienced human security and in an environment in which they've experienced popular sovereignty do not really want to be alternate. Like that tends to be unpopular. And so my hope is in resistance from the people, so to speak. Because and then added to that is that if you think about what states should care about, one of the things that most states want most of the time is some semblance of stability. And that's why, you know, we can talk about the rules-based international order, the liberal international order, or whatever. Clearly that's changing. Clearly we're not going back to where we were. But will we have right now what we have is not an alternative. We just have chaos, right? We have all of this uncertainty, all of this chaos. There's not an alternative that's a serious, credible alternative to what we had experienced. And I think countries also don't like to have a lot of refugees coming across their borders. They don't like economic migrants, they don't like climate migrants, they don't like political migrants, they don't like all of the amount of migration that we're experiencing is only going to go up with greater internal instability. And the more internal instability each country in the world has, the more global flows there will be, especially of people. And so in the end, this is a long-winded way of saying it's in the interest of states who care about their own national security to try to do something about this. And that is also why I have hope, right? Both that people want it, and it's actually in the interest of states on some level to preserve some amount of internal stability in other states in the world. Because war is constantly.
Can I make just
Absolutely.
30 seconds intervention? I think this raises the question whether we accept the underlying racism that fuels this question about migration and whether we confront it or whether we acquiesce it. Right. And the smart money now is we need to acquiesce, you take a step back, play the game, and get back in power, and then start protecting refugee rights and migrant rights. I'm sure you. I know. Yeah. I just want to say that, but that's a question. Should we acquiesce? And what are the consequences if we do? And if we do acquiesce, how do we acquiesce in the most possible principled manner, knowing that we can't be completely principled? Yeah, we wouldn't acquiesce.
Yeah, that may bring us to the US.
Yeah, let's go there. Let me ask one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Yeah.
So let's confront the elephant in the room. So one time ago, I was doing some research on the early history of Amnesty International. There was a fascinating conflict between the US branch of Amnesty International and the International Secretariat in the Netherlands in the early 1970s. At stake was the question of whether Amnesty was going to be wholly independent from governments, or whether Amnesty would adopt a strategy of working in collaboration with powerful liberal democratic governments, specifically the United States, in order to advance its agenda. The US branch won the argument, at least so far as the US branch was concerned, and in 1975 opened an Amnesty International office in Washington, D.C., with the specific objective of lobbying on Capitol Hill for human rights causes. Today, we're in a different America, a different world, a world in which the premise that human rights activists might ally with the United States seems far less plausible than it did in the aftermath of Watergate. So the question that I would like each of you to reflect upon before we turn this over to the audience is whether you think the current administration in Washington, what our campus administrators euphemistically refer to as the federal situation, is likely to prove a temporary interruption or a conclusive end of the premise that human rights and democracy can be advanced by the United States, perhaps working in collaboration with civil society organizations. So disruption or rupture.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start because I was a U.S. human rights diplomat, and I was actually in the Embassy Washington office last month, and thank God that Amnesty USA won that argument, and that they've done all the work they have, especially Human Rights Watch and so many other NGOs in the U.S. have set expectations and exerted pressures on the U.S. administrations of both parties. I just want to say very quickly and as emphatically as I can, and maybe not as diplomatically as I should, that in my experience, having been in the U.S. government in a Democratic administration, and having since worked with the U.S. government through administrations of both parties on behalf of various NGOs and otherwise, and having been summoned to my old bureau, DRL, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, who has a part of my old job just last week. I was actually brought in, invited in for 2 hours on a one-on-one. So my view is that from the mid-1970s on, and what I'm going to say may startle some of you, from the mid-1970s on, that the U.S. government, through administrations of both parties, with varying degrees of commitment, emphasis, and impact through administrations of both parties, has done more than any other government in the world to promote democracy and human rights around the world, with the huge caveat that with massive inconsistencies and hypocrisies, including in Democratic administrations, including in the one I served in from beginning to end, the Clinton administration, where for various reasons, none of which are excusable, we turned a blind eye to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. We were late doing what we did, thankfully, in Bosnia in 1995. But you have to go back. I mean, Daniel wrote about this in your book on the pivotal decade of the 1970s for U.S. foreign policy. Over Kissinger's initial objections, human rights were built into the Helsinki Final Accords, therefore into the structure of Cold War relations that provided a solvent that helped dissolve the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. The Human Rights Bureau was created then in the Carter administration, and he was a crusader for human rights. And again, it wasn't always consistent. It was Ronald Reagan, who I started my career working against passionately, who proposed what became the National Endowment for Democracy in 1982. And then we got back on track more after some aberrations in the Clinton and Bush 1 years, despite the Bureau growing, U.S. human rights diplomacy expanding in the Clinton years and beyond. But we just have to recognize the scale of U.S. human rights diplomacy and assistance through the State Department, through the late great USAID, despite making many, many mistakes along the way, of all the NGOs in the U.S. and around the world, funded by the U.S. government to take on their own governments. And again, I can't emphasize enough the inconsistencies and hypocrisies, but having traveled 80 countries, probably 50 or 60 for the U.S. government, and in multiple U.S. embassies, consulates, human rights officers, labor rights officers, here, there, and almost not quite everywhere, to trying to support human rights defenders, trying to support free and fair elections, independent media, internet freedom. So, and I'll just end with the quote, and I work closely with European NGOs and with European governments still as a private citizen, but I'll never forget Winston Lord, who was Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia Pacific Affairs in Clinton 1. I worked closely with him on U.S.-China in that period, and he took the brunt along with John Chaddick, who was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, of dealing with China in those years on human rights issues. It was very, very tough. And I never forget Wynn saying, privately, couldn't say it publicly, that the Europeans, talk about high values, but they're only too happy to hold our coats while we go in and do the dirty work. So let's not lose sight of what we're losing. The Human Rights Bureau is more or less destroyed, not entirely. I was in there for the remnants last week. USAID is gone pretty much. Funding for NGOs. And apparently embassy officials have been instructed to lie low on human rights. I was told that somebody said high up, we don't care about human rights anymore of people in other countries. So the demolition derby that we've seen the last 13 months is off the charts, in my view, damaging. And for all of the faults of the US government, in my view, the administrations of both parties, we have got to restore at least this element of US foreign policy and diplomacy if we're going to be the United States of America.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're getting good.
Sorry, I'm very passionate about
There's
this.
very good things data. We should write something together on this because I share your views completely, and I'm an NGO guy, not a former government person. It was very surprising to see that in Bush 2, W's administration, that there was very little difference on the ground between the way they operated, their foreign policy reflecting human rights, and the Clinton administration, and then followed by the Obama. There were exceptions because they had some views on some issues that just didn't. Sure. But generally, and the first point of refuge for the human rights activists was always the US Embassy. Yep. And the doors are always open, which is why I don't like when after Cambodia closed it to people who were seeking sanctuary in 1997. But this is, we need to have a professional foreign policy diplomatic service, a professional State Department, and it's there for the taking. Like, there are people working on Project 2029 for the State Department, whatever they're going to call it. So we're going to use that term, and that actually is fixable. I have no doubt about that, because the people who've worked in that for decades, they despise what's happening now, and they have their own views, but they operated as professionals and impartial, nonpartisan way.
Exactly.
You need to go on top.
I'll listen to your response.
Okay, so I think that there's a couple of reasons that are consistent with what's been said already, but first of all, I completely endorse that foreign policy most of the time doesn't change. The fact that we've seen such an abrupt change in foreign policy in this administration is unusual, both within the United States and across the foreign policies of many democratic governments. This has been measured, and we've talked about it extensively, but it usually is consistent. Why? Because it's more or less aligned with something that we might refer to as the national interest or something like that, although some people object to that. The reason why I favor the US including democracy and human rights in its foreign policy is a bit cynical. It's because when the US does not have democracy and human rights as a third or fourth tier foreign policy goal, and is not constrained by at least some kind of plausible deniability in this space, it does way worse stuff all around the world. This is when we're sponsoring coups. This is when we're, kidnapping the leaders of a country. Like, we do all kinds of garbage around the world when we are not constrained by a foreign policy of democracy and human rights. And so that, and I have studied the concept of pseudo-democracy pretty extensively. That's something that I've paid attention to in my own research. And I do also think that even when governments around the world are complying with the trappings of democratic institutions and not reforming deeply, not truly becoming democratic, it is still on average better for individuals around the world than in a world of unconstrained authoritarianism. And so for many people around the world, it's not great, but it's still marginally better to live in a country that's trying to pretend it's democratic than one that's just loves off whatever full-blown authoritarianism. Because what do? They kill political opposition. Like, they just die, right? And that's different. Can't come back.
Okay, so my efforts to elicit real disagreement from the panel have failed. So I'm going to turn it over to all of you and see if you can do any better. And I'm going to ask Jess to moderate. So thank you.
Thank you.
And Rebecca's hand up for a minute.
Yeah, I'm at risk of starting an argument with my spouse. But, and I'm sorry that the historian is just leaving, but, as the historian will point out, the nation state as a thing is not like something that has always been the case, right? Like societies have organized power and governance according to a nation state construct for a period of time, but not always. It's not the only way to organize governance and power for good or for ill in human society. And so I'm curious, we haven't heard a lot about non-state actors in the international, the international rules-based order has been a very nation state oriented centric thing. I think we're all familiar with the fact that most nation states in the global majority are actually colonial constructs to begin with. Brad referenced the fact that the nation state is part of the problem when it comes to racist anti-immigration and kind of persecution of vulnerable groups in a lot of contexts. I think it's also, in my opinion, the case that we are only seeing the beginning of how technology is disrupting and going to change human economics on this planet, culture on this planet, the way politics is and can be organized on this planet. We've only seen the beginning of that disruption. So maybe the panelists might disagree with me on that, but that's my opinion. So given that, why are we talking about nation states so much? And why are we thinking out of the box more about what ways of organizing and governing society could really serve everyone around the globe better than what we've currently got? Or is it just because it's too utopian and not practical?
Well, I mean, so I do teach on this, so that Daniel left is okay, but Hendricks Freud, The Sovereign State and Its Competitor, some of my students are here, they've read it, but there's a lot of reasons why we ended up with the nation state, right? And one of them, like the simple ones, are that trade routes required security protection, and trade required the standardization of weights and measures, and this kind of, so we think very brass tacks about like, what are the necessary things we have to have. It's hard to come up with an alternative with this many people on the planet. Now, if we burn ourselves up and we can talk about different forms of order, but it's really hard to think about how to govern a crowded planet without some system of rule of law, without some system of standardization of weights, like all this kind of stuff is very hard to engineer at scale. That said, transnationalism is a very big thing in international relations, and the networks between peoples within states is something that lots of people are focusing on. It's not just non-state actors, but the degree to which people can support each other in their human rights activism between groups around the world in the absence of foreign actors promoting democracy and human rights. What's happening in some of that vacuum is that human rights activists are working with one another, democracy activists are working with one another, transnationally to try to not to take on the entire question, but to say that some of this is happening. We didn't talk about it much today, but I think that is some reason for optimism that some of those networks are happening. The one thing that I feel like is a real threat is the surveillance state, and I wish someone will come up with a solution for activists to have some way to protect themselves against that type of surveillance, so that they can engage in transnationalism. It's a fundamental threat to those transnational networks and their abilities to support each other.
I mean, maybe before your question, you're asking how can we design a world that isn't based on a nation state? I think the more approximate question is something you and Dan will work on a lot, which is who really does control it? Is it the nation state?
Yes.
And is it not corporations, companies? And are we not watching that in real time?
Yeah.
And how do we, why, maybe that's a panel for you guys sometime. how do we imagine reflecting that? Because the scale of their wealth, their power, their influence is unprecedented. And they're not benign actors, you know. And so that's something that I think that we have not caught up with. It's a question that people are starting to think about. They're moving much faster than we are. And creating
There's more,
outcomes on the ground.
more of us.
So on that,
They're
I'm
co-opting
not
this.
gonna get into arguments, but it's a
Direct-
it's a great blue sky question, but look, picking up on the responses from Susan and more precisely Brad. Corporate power is massive. There have been efforts to constrain or at least guide it over the last quarter century. Use a fancy phrase that has maybe gone out of a little bit of fashion in the last few years, but I think has more life in it. And that is multi-stakeholders. There have been initiatives after initiatives in different focus on different industries and brought together entire industries, governments, civil society. Rebecca and I were co-founders of the Global Network Initiative that set standards for freedom of expression and right to privacy online. When I was at the State Department, I led the development of the Global Human Rights Standard for oil and mining with Human Rights Watch, the Young Arbid Nation, and Amnesty, and half a dozen other NGOs in the world, with 8 or 9 of the biggest US and UK oil and mining companies. There's now about 50 companies in it, covering 50 countries. And there are many, many more examples. So I don't think that multi-stakeholderism or multi-stakeholder initiatives are in any way a substitute for nation states, but they are a way of engaging at least and guiding to some extent and even constraining to some extent private actors, but they only work with engagement by civil society. And I'll just make one other quick point here that goes back to the student point and about what you all can do and people like you around the country and around the world. The revolt of the Gen Zs in recent months, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Tanzania, Madagascar. I'm going to miss a few. And then in the previous decade, Georgia, Ukraine, young people, teens, 20s, students, workers in the streets, some paid for it with their lives. The power of protest, the power of civil society, the power of Berkeley students from whatever university, not Berkeley, all around the world is massive. And we've seen dramatic historic demonstrations of that, not all successful, some tragic, just in recent months. So I think that the world is going to become more fractured before it becomes more unified, but that civil society and students and workers, trade unionists, human rights defenders have an absolutely critical role to play to constrain government and corporate power.
I would like to call on Jamo and also introduce him quickly in our audience. Jamo is actually speaking tomorrow, if anyone wants to come back at this time, but he's a great person to have in the audience as the Deputy Minister of Human Rights for the Myanmar pro-democracy. So yeah, as a practitioner and now a minister of a pro-democracy government in exile, I think a lot of these issues probably resonate closely with your day-to-day work over many years. So I would love to invite you to ask a question or maybe a comment.
It's brilliant to hear from the expert on the subject that's being tested so deeply on this contemporary era of the world. I think I co-lead the Ministry of Human Rights at the National Unity Government, which one direction in 2020. And part of my job is to engage with the government, particularly with US, Canada, countries like in Europe, like human rights diplomacy, as that all were touching briefly. Given today's circumstance of the United States, the job that I was leading, the diplomacy based on human rights principles and values, does not function. It doesn't work. My counterpart at the RL, Assistant Secretary of State, I don't know when was the last time I've spoken. So when we are in situations like this, we were looking at the US very high up with the hope, optimism to bring justice, democracy that people have been wanting in the country for decades at the cost of life, livelihood, everything that people could. But my question to you would be, in this such complex circumstance where the diplomacy become very much transactional and interest-based, the principality and values doesn't function. So should we go to China and talk about our critical minerals that they could take, or should we come to US to talk about like what we can offer on the table as compensation? This is a very, very dilemmatic situation where your values, principles that you fight for everything you have are being tested in a so aggressive way. And then the hope and optimism doesn't exist. So my question would be, what would be an innovative approach? What is alternative to the United States in order to get some sort of moral support in a race that we are in a race kind of between the authoritarianisms and democracy, where China and Russia is doing everything that they can to support military. And our hope was only to those democratic actors around the world, which we are unable to obtain. So what would be an innovative approach that, according to you, that we could take as a government that's partially operating inside the country and outside? We don't have a lot to offer on that level to the current administrations when it comes to the incentive that transaction. Thank you.
I mean, normally when we talk, I'm talking to undergrads and graduate students, and the consequences of my mistakes are lower. So it feels like a lot of pressure, but I think that there's a little bit of room for hope in subnational diplomacy is what we're calling it. So you're in California. California is the fourth biggest economy in the world and the home of Silicon Valley. California feels differently about a lot of this stuff, but it's a sub-state actor, cannot negotiate foreign policy. But there are, what do we call them? Track to form of negotiation. So that's all I have to add. It's just that, maybe there's room for subnational diplomacy to try to ride out this and see if it's a temporary problem or a longer term problem. That's the best that I can hope for. I don't know.
The best I can hope for is a change after the midterms that will not constrain executive power, but at least will have some accountability, but a bigger change after January 2029. But that's wishful thinking. We just don't know. But you're in a hard place, and I deeply appreciate what you do, and also the challenging question you asked. There aren't too many other governments that are in position to help. I mean, Canada is very well intentioned, but they're getting closer to China. Prime Minister Carney was just there. Australia is so dependent on China with its mining industry. The Europeans are now trying to balance the US and China, including the UK. There are not easy alternatives. There aren't easy answers. And the best hope, and I sure as hell wouldn't put money on it, but it'll be a fundamental change of administration here 1 month minus 3 years from now. But that's a lot of time for people in Burma, Myanmar to continue to suffer under this miserable junta and giving their lives, many of them in a resistance struggle. And we saw that wonderful film that you put on the panel just 3 weeks ago.
I will give you 30 seconds of suggestions that you do not even consider making any deals with China, because they will not have your interest in saying, they talk about so maybe you could convince them, if you came to power, you would do better deals than the junta, but you can't out corrupt the junta. You can't offer bigger kickbacks or more access. And And I think you would just be wasting your time because they made it very clear when Aung San Suu Kyi was in power that they did not want a democratic Myanmar. And they would actually do what it took to keep that, prevent that from happening. Same with every other country in the region. I mean, I think that you should try to take Carney up on his rhetoric. Start with him. And there's a cottage industry of looking at middle powers as he's described them. And trying to see if they can find alignment. Now, and good thing for the only thing that we've ever thought about Burma being Myanmar, apologies. Being able to make progress is that, and I'm sorry to say this, but you know this, nobody really cares. Economically, outside of China, India, nobody cares that much. So it isn't high stakes globally, geopolitically. And so if countries want to show that they care about human rights promotion, Burma is a place where Myanmar is a place. I'm sorry, we walked in.
You can be the one.
I know you're okay. I need to stop saying that.
Myanmar has been never named by the Democratic.
Which is why we didn't use it for.
That's fine.
Sorry, that's my 2 cents. I think there's something there. I mean, you have very few options, but that's maybe one way to try to thread them.
So, the title of the talk today, thank you very much. You had some fantastic insights, so really appreciate that. I have a question about the title, The Rupture, and some of the things that you touched upon. So talked about climate change, existential crisis, you've talked about the information environment, misinformation, so on and so forth. You've talked about, development, human rights, right? So I work in climate change, I teach climate change on campus. The thing that I've been trying to process, make sense of, okay, is China. I'm glad he asked the question, raised that word. When I see things happening right now, so like democracy, human rights, all these things, what are these in purpose for? Making lives of people better. Okay. Which example can you think of in the last 2 decades? Okay. That has achieved this at scale and is continuing to move in a good direction. Okay, so if you start looking at some of the data that's coming from China, whether it's uplifting people from poverty, improving quality of life, improving any number of metrics on, the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, what have you. And as of the last 3-4 years, just going bonkers with renewable energy and clean technology, not just domestically, but also I would say that, uplifting the lives in rural Pakistan, rural Africa because of solar and batteries and so on and so forth. So when I think of outcomes, the bigger rupture that we're not talking about is this notion of democracy, democratic governments achieving good outcomes for people versus this narrative that China is actively pushing that maybe democracy is not the solution, our way of doing things, which includes surveillance, censorship, homogeneity, and human rights and the way we talk about not having them, but 1 billion plus people in a very short period of time getting a far better quality of life. Now, these are all very debatable questions. So, but I want to know what you guys think about this because this is happening too. And countries, not just Myanmar, but I would make the case countries like India. I mean, sometimes you look at what Modi is doing, you feel like he's trying to get that same homogeneity in a diverse country like India that works in China. And I've worked in India quite a bit. There is a lot of fascination about how China has been able to do things. So what they're doing, this centralization, removing the democratic things, controlling the media, all those things, they're actually trying to mimic the Chinese way of organizing society so that they can deliver the development that time. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not defending anywhere the Chinese outcomes in that sense. But when I start thinking about these things, I start wondering that, why are we not talking about this? What's the way of organizing society and what should countries outside of the US and Western Europe, okay, keep them aside, glorious democracies, what should they be thinking? Where should they be looking at?
Quick. I can't imagine a more fundamental and challenging Yeah, appropriate question. Thank you. What it really boils down to is, and we got to this about an hour ago, about the failures of liberal democracy writ large to contain the inequities of globalization, to constrain technology, and a few other areas. But what you're really getting at is the challenge for democracy, not just to be about process, but outcomes, for democracy to deliver. And Biden, to his credit, coming in 2021, his mantra was that we will show that democracy delivers. And they succeeded in many ways and failed in other ways that cost them the election, largely around perceptions, if not fully realities of both inflation and border security. Keir Starmer came in with a labor landslide thanks to their oddly structured electoral first past the post system after 3 Tory governments in 4 years, if I have that right. And their whole mantra has been, we're going to deliver, and yet it's widely perceived they haven't. This is a crisis of government, liberal democracy after liberal democracy, whether liberal democracy from the left of center or the center right. We haven't delivered at scale on climate. China is writing the book, despite still burning coal at high levels, but phasing out. So the China model, while deeply unattractive when it comes to civil society and human rights, has produced historic benefits. Singapore would argue that in their small city state, they have as well. So I think the challenge is not to look to alternatives to democracy, but to work much harder and much more realistically with almost a militant pragmatism on how democracy can deliver. And there's a lot of work that's been done on that, not just in the US, but in other democracies around the world. But if we don't deliver, we lose our democracies. And that's the crisis we're facing in the US now. So your question couldn't possibly be more useful. I really appreciate that.
We only have 2 or 3 minutes left. I don't know if you want to chime in, or we can take a couple of quick
I'm going to
questions.
say very quickly, I don't question your values, but it's a values question.
Yeah.
And those of us who've been lucky enough to live with some freedom will not trade it. Most of us will not trade it. And the problem is that many of the people you're talking about have benefited from Chinese investments in a country never had freedom, so they haven't lost anything from the Chinese coming in. So they say marginally we're better off, and that's accurate.
Yeah.
One more quick question.
Both, all of you have talked about the effect of the surveillance state, but on almost with the tone of it being outside effects on NGOs and international effects, but we're directly seeing like, the direct attacks of our own civil society in our own country. How do you, although we can think about professionalizing the State Department again, rebuilding that professional aspect of kind of the like intergovernment structure, how do we build the trust as a civil society that we can achieve what we can without being directly attacked from our own government? If we are going to attack things like climate change and human rights, even if we do better in like a post-midterm state, how do we rebuild that kind of action and trust again?
It's a great question. I think there has to be some counter technological developments that would make me feel a little bit more secure. The answer can't just be like signal. I don't think that's the answer, but so I'm hoping that there will be some pendulum swing away from what we're currently experiencing, but it does feel like the surveillance state is trying to stay here. And
I think the clock tower is telling us that that's a wrap. So, I mean, if anyone wants to stick around, I don't know if our speakers can touch base informally, but otherwise, thank you for coming. I appreciate having you here.
I've read